Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Welcome to this episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. Today's episode is about using social media to spread your voice beyond your local reach. Obviously, social media has had a tremendous impact on our lives in its relatively short existence, from connecting with friends and families to how we get our news to professional development. But how can physicians and other healthcare professionals really take advantage of it, and should they? I discussed this with my guest, Dr. Kevin Poe. He started the KevinMD website long ago, and he talks about how he got started and how it's grown and allowed him to become a leading physician. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. I'm excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. Kevin Poe. Many of you will know him from the website that he founded, KevinMD. Dr. Poe went to undergrad and med school and residency at the Boston University and the Boston University Medical Center, and he practices internal medicine currently in Nashua, New Hampshire. His KevinMD website is one of the leading platforms on the internet for healthcare professionals to share their perspective on matters relating to their profession. He's also on the editorial board of USA Today and has been interviewed by CBS News and given many keynote addresses to physician groups and conferences. He's also co-authored a book, Establishing, Managing, and Protecting Your Online Reputation, a social media guide to physicians and medical practices. Dr. Poe, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So let's just talk a bit about your background. What got you into medicine? And then talk a little bit after that about your website. What made you start the website?
Sure. So one of the reasons why I got into medicine is because I wanted to really give patients a voice. And whenever they come see a doctor, they're at their most vulnerable. And we have such a dysfunctional healthcare system where patients are often silenced or they don't have a say in terms of what happens to them. So as a physician, I wanted to give patients that voice as they navigate our dysfunctional healthcare system. And certainly that has evolved throughout my career in terms of giving not only patients a voice, but physicians a voice. And we're going to be talking about how social media gives us a platform where everyone can have a voice. But it really started because I wanted to give patients that voice when they're at their most vulnerable, when they enter our healthcare system.
Okay. And so talk about when you started the KevinMD site and the growth that you've had over the years.
Sure. So I started KevinMD back in the spring of 2004. So that was 13 years ago. And when it comes to social media, 13 years ago, I'm pretty much a dinosaur when it comes to healthcare social media. And obviously at that time, there were only a handful of physician bloggers. Heck, even blogging was in its infancy back then. And I really had no idea what to expect or where this was going. So I think it started back in 2004. There was a major drug recall. There was a medicine called Vioxx, which is Merck's anti-inflammatory, that got recalled at that time. And I remember writing a column on that on my site, talking about what patients should do, what kind of questions they should ask their doctors. And a few days after I published that post, I remember a patient in the exam room. I walked into the exam room, and the first thing she said to me was, "Thank you, Dr. Poe. I read your blog post this morning, and it was comforted to read what you had to say, and now I know what kind of questions to ask." And I think that was the proverbial light bulb moment for me, where I realized that I had a voice outside the exam room. And with my blog, I was able to interact with not only one patient in the exam room, but many patients at once. And having this power as a physician, just having this publishing power was tremendously liberating and tremendously powerful. And obviously that has evolved over the years. We not only have blogs, but we also have Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. We have dozens and dozens of social media platforms. And it's tremendously powerful for doctors to utilize these tools, not only to connect with patients, but we'll be talking about certainly how they can use it to define their online reputations and really how to make their voices heard as our healthcare system is evolving. And I think these tools have given this type of publishing power to the every person. And of course, that translates to all of us in healthcare as well.
And so you've mentioned, obviously, your blog has exploded in the medical community, and lots of physicians now post on it and read it. And so how has that changed your professional life? You still practice medicine, correct?
I do. I have a primary care clinic in Nashua, New Hampshire, and I see patients 4 days a week still. And it's something I still, of course, I love to do. And I think the blog gives me a balance. I think that physician burnout certainly is a topic that is very prominent right now, especially on my site. And there are just so many pressures when it comes to practicing medicine. You have to see patients every 10 to 15 minutes. We're dealing with clunky electronic medical records. And one of the things I always talk to doctors when I do talk about burnout is that physicians need to have a passion outside of clinical medicine that parallels their clinical medicine journey. And for me, it's my family, of course, but also what I do on Kevin MD. And having these passions really gives me that balance where I can not only do things outside of clinical medicine, but it will help me maintain my passion for clinical medicine. So it's been so gratifying that not only to read what these thousands of voices have to say about what they're going through, and I've learned so much by reading not only their stories, but stories from patients as well to gain their perspective. So I think that having my site, it's really enriched my view of medicine, and it's really opened up a window into the larger healthcare world and some of the stories that they're sharing as well.
Right. And so let's talk about social media. So your blog obviously started before the explosion of social media, and your blog is still up on the web, kevinmd.com. But now you also have, or your site has accounts for Twitter, Facebook. How has social media changed your blog? And then also, how has it changed your actual medical practice?
Sure. So the blog has certainly evolved, and I think that information consumption as a whole has also evolved as well. People don't just go to a website now to read information. They consume information from different silos. For instance, you could either go to New York Times to read a website. You can get the New York Times feed on Facebook, on Twitter. You could read various New York Times podcasts. So I think that information consumption has become siloed, and I've kind of mirrored that on my site. Obviously, I have the stories on my site 6 to 8 times per day, but I also broadcast those posts on different silos as well, specifically Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I have Google+, I have Pinterest, because different people consume that information in different ways. So I think that Kevin MD is no longer just a blog. I like to call it a social media platform where a lot of my posts aren't only consumed on kevinmd.com, but also on the various social media platforms as well. So how does it change my practice? I think that I'm certainly found easier. If you look at some recent studies, about half of patients, they Google their doctors before they see them. And when my name is Googled, obviously my various online assets come up, not only my blog, but also on Facebook and Twitter. So people can proverbially meet me before they see me in the exam room. And it's also giving me a semblance of control over how I appear online. I'm no longer just defined by a random physician rating site, but by being active in social media, it's made me proactive in terms of how I appear online, and I can have some semblance of control of what my Google presence is. And I think going forward, that's tremendously powerful because more and more doctors are going to be online whether they like it or not, and more patients are going to be Googling their doctors. So I think it's important for everyone in healthcare, whether you're a doctor or a dentist or an allied health professional, to have that control of their online presence, because whether they like it or not, if they don't do it themselves, other people are going to do it for them.
The average physician today sees that, okay, they may have a personal Facebook account, but they're not really certain about these other platforms, such as maybe Twitter or LinkedIn. They may have their own professional LinkedIn profile, but probably aren't that active on it. Other than just sharing their typical Facebook friends and family posts, how do you encourage them to actually get more professionally involved?
Normally, when I talk to doctors, they're a little bit apprehensive about social media. They always hear social media from a perspective of risk. I'm sure they get talks at their hospital or at their clinic from risk managers and lawyers, and they always show stories, front page headlines about doctors and nurses getting fired because they're taking pictures of people's body parts in the operating room and
Exactly.
emergency room, right?
Exactly.
You hear stories like that all the time.
Yes.
So if you're a practicing physician, you ask yourself, why the heck am I going to be using social media? It has nothing positive can ever come of it. So what I do is I try to present social media from a perspective of a more positive perspective. And I think it does have tremendous positives for physicians. I normally start by Googling a physician's name, and a lot of them are surprised because they already have an online presence. And that's in the form of these physician rating sites like RateMDs or Health Grades or Vitals. Whether doctors like it or not, they already have that type of online presence, and they could be populated by less than stellar ratings. So for a lot of doctors, that's really that type of light bulb moment. They say, hey, I already have an online presence, but I'm not in control of it. So what should they do to take control of their online presence? I always recommend LinkedIn first. LinkedIn is, as you know, a professional social network, and simply filling out a LinkedIn profile is just a digital translation of one's CV. So just put in your CV into LinkedIn and put in a nice picture, and you put in a summary, and you have a complete LinkedIn profile that gets ranked high on Google searches, and in a lot of cases can rank even above things like Health Grades and RateMDs and push them lower down on the search page so they become less visible. So that's number one. And number two, I recommend Doximity. Doximity is a physician social network. And again, a profile there is just a translation of your CV. In fact, you could even upload your CV to Doximity, and they will have staff members enter it into their profile for you. So those are the two that I would start off with at a minimum. And doing that probably takes a few hours to do at most. And then after doing that, physicians should stop and ask themselves, what do they want to use social media for? And if the answer is nothing, then that's better than nothing. I think that what they've done already by creating that profile on LinkedIn and Doximity is plenty powerful enough, and will put them ahead of the game compared to the majority of their peers.
Okay. And how about those that may want to go a little bit further? What platforms would you, as far as professional development goes, what platforms besides, like you said, Doximity and LinkedIn, would you establish your MD presence as your personal, like a Facebook page, Instagram? Any recommendations that way? Or
I'm going to reframe that question. I'm going to ask, what's their ultimate goal when they come to use social media? Do they want to use social media to connect and educate patients? Do they want to use social media to connect with their colleagues? Or do they want to use social media to advocate for a cause or debate healthcare reform topics? And depending on what their goals are, there are specific social media platforms that fit those goals. For instance, if physicians are interested in connecting with patients, I think having a professional Facebook page is tremendously powerful. If they want to do video to connect with patients, they can certainly do YouTube or, again, a Facebook page. If they want to connect with colleagues, I think Twitter is probably better suited for that because there's a lot of professional conversations that happen on Twitter, or they can start a blog. But if they want to create their own content, which I think is really the ultimate social media endpoint, then they should certainly start a blog, create videos on YouTube or Facebook. I think, and then they could do what I do and disseminate that information on the various social media silos that surround that. So the answer to that is really, what do they want to use social media for? And depending on those goals, there are various platforms that best fit those specific goals. And physicians are going to realize that the more social media platforms that they engage in, the bigger their online presence will be anyway. So rather than approaching it from a question, what social media platform should they engage in, start with the goals first, and then the presence would sort itself out as you use social media to fit those goals.
And depending on what your goal would be, would you recommend doing it yourself, hiring a social media marketing person? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that there are pros and cons to both. Obviously, when you do social media yourself, it does take a little bit of time. But I think that if you can do it yourself, you should, because you should educate yourself with these tools, because social media isn't going away. Patients are going to be used to a certain amount of transparency. If you see other industries, whether you go to Amazon, whether you book a hotel, airline, restaurant, there's a certain amount of transparency in other industries that people are going to expect. And eventually healthcare is going to catch up to that. So there's a certain expectation that patients are going to have. So I think as physicians, we do need to educate ourselves with the various tools that are available to us. And also, more importantly than that, if physicians themselves use social media, it's their voice. It's a more authentic voice rather than outsourcing it to a social media marketer. So it's best that physicians learn how to use these tools and speak with their own voice. Now, that being said, if you're a busy doctor and you really don't have the time for this, yes, spending the money and outsourcing it to a social media consultant is better than nothing. It's better than having no social media presence. So if your choices are not doing it at all versus outsourcing it, then yes, outsourcing it probably would be better than nothing.
And I think a lot of people think that, well, I can understand for those physicians or dentists who, have their own practice or are trying to promote their private practice. But what about for those who are employed and they're not trying to drum up business? Do you still think that it's important to establish a presence that way?
I do, because even if you work for a hospital or a large employer, when a patient sees that particular doctor, they're not necessarily going to Google, the Mayo Clinic. They're not going to Google the, Kaiser Permanente. They're going to still Google that individual doctor. I'm seeing Dr. Poe. I'm going to Google that doctor. And what comes up is still information that's specific to that physician's name, is not going to be specific to the institution. So I do think that it's important for every physician, whether they work independently or work for a large healthcare conglomerate, to take charge of their individual online presence. Also, you may not be with that same employer forever, right? People change jobs. So I think that's also important, that you take control of your own individual online presence, and you don't want to leave that in the hands of your employer. So
now let's flip to the other side of things. You see many young medical students, residents, pre-meds, they have large social media followings. What cautions or advice would you have for them before they even really are into their prime practice years about social media?
I think that they should evaluate what's been written in the past and assume that residency directors and credentialing committees are Googling them, because they are. And I know for a fact that hospital credentialing committees Google every applicant. I know residency directors, they Google applicants. So it's tremendously important to be aware of what comes up when your name is Googled, what's public on your Facebook profile, what's public on Instagram. You want to be aware of that and clean that up, obviously, because not only is that going to cost you when you apply for residency or apply for a job, but also prospective patients are going to be seeing this as well when they Google you looking for a physician. So I always have a rule of thumb when I talk to every physician, whether they're young or old. It's called the elevator test. And it goes like this: whatever is posted online, it needs to be appropriate if you say it aloud in a crowded hospital elevator. So I think you want that to be the minimum standard when it comes to your public presences on every social media network. I think that's a good baseline for anything, because I feel like a lot of people who didn't grow up with social media are very frightened by it. And then on the flip side, a lot of people who are growing up in this social media age are so accustomed to it that they are sometimes a little bit too open, but then that just may be the sign of the times. So it may just be where I'm at on. No, absolutely. And I think that physicians, they need to realize that, fair or not, we are held to a higher standard in the public compared to anyone else. So what we say or do, obviously, is a reflection not only of ourselves, but of the profession, of who we work for as well. And the consequences that physicians face is greater than most every profession. So whether that's fair or not, that's part of the burden and responsibility of being a physician. So I think that's something that we all have to keep in mind. I do want to talk about your coaching program that you have and what physicians can gain from that. Sure. So I recently started a physician coaching program because I realized that a lot of the skills that we talked about in this podcast, they're just not known by a lot of doctors. Specifically using social media to define their online reputation. I went over some basics, but there's certainly more to do than that. But there are a lot of doctors who want to step outside of their clinical work and they want to be a speaker. They want to keynote medical conferences. And in order to do that, you have to build an online platform. So I've been doing this for 13 years now, and I can say that knowing and learning all of this stuff online, that's almost like having another degree almost, right? And they absolutely don't teach this in medical school and residency. So I definitely wanted to give other physicians and health professionals an opportunity where I can share my knowledge and coach them one-on-one to realize their goals. I would work with them not only to define their online reputation, but if they want, I can expand their social media platform and I could share exactly what I do to help some of my pieces go viral and be heard. And also I can certainly coach them in terms of being a speaker and what event organizers are looking for when they're looking for a physician keynote speaker, how to structure their talks, how to deliver their talks, how to work on their visuals, what are some of the cutting edge trends when it comes to keynote speaking. Because this is stuff that no one taught me. I had to do a lot of research in other industries and take my own lumps on the keynote circuit as well. And I think that this is valuable information to pass on to physicians because this type of stuff isn't readily available.
I think, there's so much to learn in medical school that unfortunately so much gets crowded out. And aside from just the medical knowledge that we have to continuously educate ourselves on, there's an entire other realm of business and personal knowledge and things like that kind of get pushed aside, but also need to be put in the curriculum, whether it's in medical school, residency, or whatnot. So it's great that people like yourself are doing these kind of things and helping other physicians out. Dr. Poe, I want to thank you for appearing on the podcast. I did have another quick question, though. So what do you see in the next 5 or 10 years for Kevin MD?
I'm certainly happy with my current trajectory. It's now a platform where thousands of healthcare voices can tell their stories and get their voices heard. And as you know, with our healthcare system, there's always going to be topics to talk about. So I see continued growth. I see the platform enlarging, and I see that this is a needed platform because doctors often don't have a voice. When you read New York Times on the editorial pages, you see a lot of doctors who aren't necessarily frontline clinicians. They don't necessarily see patients. And I think it's important to have the voice of the practicing physician out there because if we don't have a say, if we don't make decisions, these decisions will be imposed on us by politicians and non-practicing clinicians. So I think Kevin MD is going to grow in importance. I think that it's one of the few, if only, platforms where doctors can have that prominent publishing space where they can tell their frontline stories. And I think that voice is going to be tremendously important as we move forward because as physicians, we cannot be marginalized in the healthcare debate.
Right. And if any of our listeners want to get an article or something published on Kevin MD, how do they do that?
They'll go to kevinmd.com and up top there is a contribute tab with specific instructions on what type of articles I like. I can tell you right off the bat, I like stories. I think stories are very powerful, and I think that the public, they don't have access to a lot of physician stories. So I am partial to some of the stories that physicians face every day. But they can go to kevinmd.com and go to the contribute tab, and there'll be instructions there on how they can contribute an article.
Great. And if they wanted to get your book that we mentioned earlier about social media, is that available on your website as well, or?
It is available on my website as well as Amazon. So you can go to kevinmd.com and click the book tab, and it's establishing, managing, and protecting your online reputation. And also, if you're interested in coaching as well, it's all on kevinmd.com. So it's easy to find.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and we look forward to more great things from Kevin MD and yourself in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Poe for agreeing to do this podcast. He had agreed to do this podcast at a time when I just started out and really had no audience. I purposely delayed releasing this episode in order to build up the audience on my own a little bit. And I want to thank you, the listeners, for being part of that growth. One of the great things about social media is that it's allowed us to get into contact with people like Dr. Poe, who are generous with their time and expertise. I hope he inspired you to get out there and get your voice heard on social media. It's vitally important that physicians and other healthcare professionals with real scientific expertise engage the public and not be drowned out by the celebrity pseudoscience that's becoming more and more prevalent. Dr. Poe's website is Kevin MD. I'm sure you all heard of it. Just Google Kevin MD or kevinmd.com. He also recently started a physician speaking Facebook group in order to help physicians develop into speakers at conventions, conferences, and in front of meetings. And so I encourage you to join his group. I also encourage you to join my Dr. Money Matters Facebook group where we discuss financial topics, and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues by text, WhatsApp, or whatever social media platform that you currently are on. You can listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, And the episodes are now also available on YouTube. And as usual, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Money Matters, or Facebook, Dr. Money Matters, or Instagram, Dr. Money Matters. And on Facebook and Instagram, it's Doctor spelled out. So thanks again for listening. Please leave positive reviews for this and any other podcast that you listen to.